Well, why is it important for us to understand where the founders got their ideas from? Well, let me ask you another question. How many have heard that the Constitution is a secular document? Some of you? How many have heard that the Constitution is godless? There's actually books out there about the godless Constitution. How many think that, and of course many of you are not going to think that because it's been drilled very well at this camp. How many have heard, at least, that most of the founders were not more than deists or, marginal Christians at best, and that didn't influence their thinking whatsoever when they wrote these documents? And who, if you can think, do you hear from secular sources and maybe even from some of your own counterparts? Some of the sources of the founders' thinking. Have you heard? That this founder referenced this Enlightenment thing. You hear Rousseau, you hear Locke, you hear Montesquieu, you hear a number of others. Mostly in today's modern, if you go to college and you start studying on this period, they're going to try to convince you that the founders were mainly Enlightenment rationalists who drew toward those particular thinkers for their concepts of government. We're going to show you a little bit different picture. You see, you do need to read the events of the founding, not in terms of the interpretation by today's standards, but you need to read it in terms of the past. Those things, those influences that were happening at the time that led to founding perspectives. Because we have a marked and revisionist history in this country these days. And unfortunately, you'll find it in your high school textbooks. They try to tell you that the founders believed one way, when you read their original writings, it's very clear that they believed in an entirely different direction. Back about 15 years ago, two professors from the University of Houston did a survey of the sources of the founders' quotations. They looked at all the extant writings they could find of every founding era thinker, and they put them together between 1760 and 1805. And they showed that of these, the number one source for the quotes from the founders was the Bible. 34% of the quotes from all the writings of the founders came directly from the Bible. 9% of all of those quotes came directly from St. Paul, from the epistles of Paul in the New Testament. The book in the Bible that was referenced most frequently by the founders was, anybody want to have a guess at this one? And no camp director, I know you know the answer. No? Well, which book do you think? All right, camp.
Deuteronomy.
Deuteronomy, the book of Deuteronomy, the book of the law. That was the number one most referenced book by the founders of all the books. And again, 34% of their writings. Now, that would be impressive enough, but if you really dig into it, that the other 60+% of the quotes, about 60% of those where they quoted other thinkers, those thinkers were sourcing the Bible as their foundation for their comments. And that's what we're going to be talking about today, are those thinkers and where they're drawing from. And a speaker, fairly well-known speaker called Charlie Tremendous Jones, and some of you may have heard some of his work, has said something I think is very important to keep in mind here, that a man's character is formed by the company he keeps and the books he reads. Now, we all know, at least in some form, of the company the founders kept. We know the other signers of the Declaration of Independence. We know the men who were involved in the Constitutional Convention. We know the thinkers of the day, that they were contemporaries of. So we're going to be looking more at the books they read. But this formed the character of our founders. And we'll see, I think, that it's a different picture than what modern secular scholarship wants to paint. Now, I think the other source you need to look at is what your enemies say about you. And if I get this to move. There it is, okay. So we're going to look at an opposition voice to start with. Peter Oliver, who was a colonist, he was a loyalist, also known as a Tory, who believed that the American war for independence was a rebellion against just authority, and he points the finger of blame at a certain source for this uprising. In his letter that he wrote called The Origin and Progress of the American Revolution back in 1781, he said, "It may now be amiss to reconnoiter Mr. Otis's Black Regiment, the dissenting clergy, who took so active a part in the rebellion. Among those who were most distinguished of the Boston clergy were Dr. Charles Chauncey, Dr. Jonathan Mayhew, and Dr. Samuel Cooper. And they distinguished themselves in encouraging seditions and riots until those lesser offenses were absorbed in rebellion." Now, if you just read this letter from Peter Oliver, you would think that you had pastors up in the pews lighting torches and handing pitchforks and guns to their parishioners and saying, "Now go out in the street and find a British soldier and string him up at the closest tree." Was that what they were preaching? Is that the kind of influence that was happening? And he believes that it was all being drawn down. They call it the Black Regiment. How many have heard that phrase before? A few of you have. Okay, we got a few in here who've gone through some of this before. Well, what was the Black Regiment? Well, the Black Regiment, as Oliver pointed out, were the dissenting clergy. Some of them who were fairly well known. Well, the Reverend Jonathan Mayhew, who was a preacher in Boston at the time. This is some of that sedition and rebellion that Jonathan Mayhew preached. Now, in his discourse concerning unlimited submission and non-resistance to the higher powers. Now, I'll have you note the date this sermon came out, 1750. 2 decades prior to the Declaration and the start of the American War for Independence. Now, here's what Reverend Mayhew was feeding his flock in Boston. He says, "No civil rulers are to be obeyed when they enjoin things that are inconsistent with the commands of God." Now, did he say civil rulers are not supposed to be obeyed at all? No, that's not what he was saying. If they require something that's inconsistent with the commands of God, all such disobedience is lawful and glorious. Does that sound like sedition and rebellion to you? I'll leave you to think about that. All commands running counter to the declared will of the supreme legislator of heaven are null and void, and therefore disobedience to them is a duty, not a crime. Sounds slightly seditious, now doesn't it? Reed's right back there just pumping his heels. He's ready to go. That's good. But you know what is he saying here? He's saying a number of things. First of all, he's saying that, yes, civil authority is legitimate, but they have a higher standard to draw to. He talks about the commands of God, the declared will of the supreme legislator of heaven and earth. So that what he was preaching was, if civil authorities violate God's law, then they are not to be obeyed. Now, where would we have heard that kind of an idea in some earlier work, say, Scripture? Nobody's read this in Scripture anywhere? It is better to obey God rather than to obey man? New Testament?
Acts.
This is a biblical concept. If you were required by a civil authority, as the Romans were doing in the first century, to violate God's law in favor of man's law, civil disobedience was not only preferred, it was required. Well, maybe he was just basically preaching Paul. He was just preaching out of the book of Acts and the epistles of Paul. But according to many at the time of Oliver and his ilk, they were preaching sedition and rebellion.